Okay, so welcome back to our continuing formation series with continuing on Soul of the Apostolate. And last time we went over the first section of the book, talking about why the interior life needed to be ordered first towards, or why we should always make the interior life the focus of our sanctification. And then we looked at several other authors as well in regards to the topic of how many of the mystical works, like that of St. John of the Cross, some of the life of various great mystics like St. Bruno of the Carthusians, because they were contemplatives, there was a certain manifestation of gifts within them, but that in our lives, because we are not contemplatives, we are not living in a monastery where there's very little interaction with the world, that the gifts manifest themselves, or they tend to manifest themselves more in one's life or active labors than necessarily in mystical things. Though it also pointed out that sometimes you have people that have both the mystical and the active fruition of their life. And that we need the active life in part to help us work out all the problems, and that the active life should be a source of struggle and conflict and suffering. And that is where we're going to pick up on, is how the fruits begin to manifest themselves in our life. And then we're also going to look at why being faithful to one another, why brotherhood is actually more important than active works, while doing a few things together and supporting one another and showing great care of each other and being our brother's keeper is more important than any type of big thing within the church. So in the second part of the book, he starts off with an example of two orphanages that basically both the two communities showed great, or at least they appeared to be very good communities, but yet when the children left their home, almost all of the children became reprobates. All of them fell away from the practice of the faith, except maybe one. There was one child who did not. But then one of the homes went through a reform because they had a new mother superior came through, and another home went through a reform because a new spiritual director, a new chaplain came in for the sisters. And after these new people who were much more oriented towards the interior life, instead of the nuns having a kind of as he describes it, right, a vapid, pietistic, feeling-based religion, it becomes this deep Christianity that forms up valiant people. It was a Christianity rooted in presenting to people the necessity of suffering and conformity with that suffering. And it changed people from being captives, where they lived their life in this orphanage where they were forced to go. I'm adding in details. They're forced to go to Mass. They're forced to go to confession. They're forced to go to their studies. And so they spend their time longing for when they can escape, like a convict in prison, right, who spends his time thinking about going back to his life of depravity, versus people who want to embrace arduous things so that they can love Christ and the cross. Now, throughout the book, or throughout the chapters, he talks about why the consequences of this is that he talks about how preachers, when they go out to retreats, how hellfire sermons are good, sermons on heaven are good, but they're not as effective as fostering within us a real longing and love of Jesus Christ. Okay, so And then if we look at examples from Holy Scripture on this topic, if we consider that, when we'll start with our Lord and then we'll look at other examples throughout salvation history. Our Lord Jesus Christ spent intimate time with the apostles. Of the apostles, he had an inner circle of 3. Of the disciples, which numbered quite a few, there were about 50, though, he showed particular attention to, and then there were about 500 total who were devout men. And if you think about this for a moment, it reflects a certain human reality. Now, this is a fact of life. And I forgot what the psychologist talked about it, but he said that it was impossible for a human being to have more than about 3 very intimate friendships. Very intimate. It was possible to have 12 to 15 friends and about 50 friendlies or acquaintance style people you are aware of and may think of and may deal with, but they're not necessarily a normal part of your life. Now, but we know there was 500. Now, think about what that means. Well, of the 50, each one probably had about 12 intimate associations himself. And when dealing with a figure like Christ, who was considered a malefactor, a criminal, a blasphemer, you would not probably continue an association with somebody unless you were deeply intimate. If they were one of their intimate friends and known to them, you would push them off. We know this for a fact because just look at if somebody says something politically incorrect regarding sins like those that deal with the city of San Francisco, any perceived sin dealing with men who do not want to wear the appropriate clothing to their gender, how quickly they'll be disowned by the acquaintances, not necessarily by their own, but by their acquaintances. We can begin to understand these numbers that were laid out in the scriptures because they're a part of human reality. Which brings us to the shock troops. Have you gotten that far, all of you? Do you remember the shock troops? Do you remember have you gotten to the shock troops? Okay. Our author says something that would be shocking to modern sensibilities. That it would be better for a priest at his parish to focus his main ministry on being a good spiritual director to about 12 or 15 people than it would be for him to run massive events at the church, big retreats, anything else. It was more important to build up the relationships and really guide 12 to 15 men towards a life of sincere piety than it was for any other work. That was the best and most important work of a priest. To which I would say it's actually the best and most important work of every Christian, because every Christian to some degree, although we're all disciples, most Christians outside of children tends to be, we all have these connections at which we either need to bring people into Christ, encourage people in Christ, right? And if people aren't willing to go along with us, then we have to shake them off. Now, there's some notable exceptions to that, which are outlined in books like The Introduction to the Devout Life, but this is just a fact. There's a modern author by the name of Theodore Dalrymple who I particularly like reading. He's a psychiatrist. And he commented on one of the things that shocked him after he left his profession, he retired from psychiatric care, was how many people who he regarded as friends who after he retired ceased to deal with him at all. I remember when I left the grocery store, There were a lot of people I worked with every day, and I thought I'd continue to see them. I didn't maintain a relationship with any of them. There was a few attempts, but because we weren't coming together in work for the most part, I didn't deal with them anymore. Same thing with school. So many relationships are relationships of convenience. So the most important thing we can do is build up 12 to 15 people. Now let's apply this to the knights. Now, as you know, and according to our Grand Master, we always put our families first if we're married. But if not, who comes next? The brotherhood. This is a hard thing to, if one has many connections, to constantly turn down invitations because the brotherhood's meeting, or the brotherhood's going to prayer, or the brotherhood has retreats. And if one is not willing to enter into that, then they are not willing to put the brotherhood right next to family where it must be. Because otherwise, there isn't the care, there isn't the sincerity present to be able to take vows to live out this rule. And we see that when we begin to see the rule and we begin to see its triumph in us as the main means at which we give glory to God, as the main means at which we subdue our passions, as the pretext that characterizes our central principle of the confession of our Christian faith, so that we are able to react to the slightest attack upon the glory of God or upon the church, that we are able to give an ordered signal of outburst of anger to evil, while at the same time maintaining that gentle disposition that makes our Christianity, our faith, attractive and compelling to those around us. Without this mortification, without this love of the brotherhood, without this exclusion of others, we create false idols where we say that some hobby or some activity is at parallel, not just with the activity or the things scorned from the brotherhood, like a retreat, like vespers, like novice, to novice master discussion or spiritual direction, but that this thing, for whatever moment, that somehow in the cosmic scheme of whateverness has a rightful place in the glory of God. And that doesn't make any sense. Because when we commit ourselves to this life, it is a gift that is free and total. It is a gift that is free and total, just like a marriage. It is a unique affection given not just to the rule, but to one another. So much so that it is a right and good thing for a husband to be jealous of his making sure that his wife does not have affection for other men. It's a good thing that a man makes sure that in his wife's eyes, he's number one. It is a completely lovable thing for a woman to be possessive of her man. And it is a right and good thing for this brotherhood to be possessive of one another. Now, certain tolerance for weakness is always there. Certain kindness exists between members, but we always must maintain that principal part. Through this exclusion of others, we see in the book, for example, that the author talks about how when this interiorness comes out in our life, when we truly embrace the interior life principally, which, of course, once again, perfection in the interior life for us is the careful and close observance of our rule, that within us the spirit of mortification begins to show, that the mystery of the cross sinks deeply within us, and that, as he says, uh, that is to mortify as quote to mortify oneself is to reproduce the Christ who did not please himself, that is to renounce ourselves under all circumstances, to get to love everything that displeases our nature, and finally to tend to the ideal of being a victim that is emulated without ceasing every moment of the day. Now, without that, without embracing that fully, all we have to do is choose to not pursue it. And then the author goes on to say, they are enemies of the cross of Christ. St. Paul would say of the numerous Christians who only see in Christianity a form of social conformity, men for whom our religion is nothing but a habit of certain external practices, handed down by tradition and carried out from time to time with respect, of course, but without any relation to the amendment of life, the combat against the passions, or the introduction of the gospel into the spirit of our practical living. So even the outward observance of our rule, the attendance at Vespers, the wearing of the habit, everything else, unless this is not being done for the right reasons, we are enemies of the cross of Christ. One of the things that stood out particularly to me um, in the chapter was when he spoke about, and as I was speaking with our Dom Jason this morning, I made a little joke about something. I said, well, I've always found it to be easier to be self-sacrificing when other people are noticing. um, Speaking as the sinner that I am. It is very easy to identify within ourselves whether or not we possess this true spirit of religion. The example that he used when talking about this outward observance, but nevertheless, even within doing extra, is he says, quote, one might think that this enthusiasm would be quite legitimate when there were questions of people making frequent communions. But at this point, a memory of my trip to America comes to mind. As I visited certain parishes, I was delighted to find out that a good number of men there were faithful to the communion of the first Friday of the month. But a holy New York priest commented on my delight. Homo videt et faci dens optum incorde. Men sees the face, but God sees the heart. Do not forget, he went on, that you are in a country where nobody is held back by human respect and where bluff is fairly universal. Restrain your admiration until you come to a parish where a reliable observer can testify that frequent communion is a genuine indication, if not of a complete amendment of life, of at least sincere efforts to lead a Christian life, and a loyal desire not to compromise with heavy drinking and the ruthless ambition to make a lot of money. Of course, this was speaking at a time where, in a lot of the Christian world, frequent communion was still a rare matter, but not in America, where people would just go up to communion frequently. I don't know. It's just who we are, Americans. Anyway. The author goes on to once again say that, quote, only an apostle who is disinterested, humble, and chaste can lead souls on into the battle against the ever-growing forces of greed, ambition, and impurity. Only an apostle who has learned the science of the crucifix will be able to check that everlasting search for comfort and ease and worship of pleasure that threatens to sweep the whole world and undermine families and whole nations to their eventual destruction. One of the most distressing things that we can observe in the church today, and I'm sure you've all heard me say this before, but have you all heard my talk about franchise Christianity? Jason? No? There is a certain franchise Christianity. We won't talk about the false versions of it, but only true in Catholicism. It is the attitude that if you can observe certain things, then you're okay. It is an ungenerous, lukewarm, mediocre, and awful form of Christianity. It does not deal with the reality that men are weak and that it takes time to grow, but rather it deals with a clerical laziness of a bunch of men who at some point, through whatever reason, lost their zeal themselves. And thus, being bland and cold, they have no ability to enkindle fire or devotion in others. Lukewarm Christianity says to you, go to daily mass, say your rosary, go to confession every 2 weeks, say the liturgy of the office, morning or evening prayer, and read the Bible occasionally, maybe every day even. None of that is impressive. None of that is a lot. It is true that it is more than most people do. It is true that to do that day in and day out can be difficult. But in and of itself, none of it's praiseworthy. It's completely possible to do everything I just said there in a state of mortal sin. The annals of the church are filled with records. And if you want to be terrified, just go read old monastic literature. I'll give you a story. There was once a monk, a man who committed a heinous and horrible sin. I don't even know what it is. And he realized he needed to do penance, so he joined a monastery. And when you enter a monastery, they make you confess, but he decided to omit the sin from confession. He then proceeded to live for decades in this monastery and had a reputation for the most outstanding holiness because of all the penance he did, of all the extra prayers, vigils, mortifications, penances, the little he ate. But you know what else he didn't do? He never went to confession for it. He never confessed the sin that was plaguing his conscience. He eventually died. And then the abbot had a vision. He went to hell. Why? Well, he had been more or less engaging in sacrilegious confessions and communions for decades. Outwardly, he had the appearance of the saint. Inwardly, his pride kept him from true contrition. That is an example, although be it a different one, of that spirit of franchise Christianity. I know a devout woman who once went on retreat, talked to the priest, listened to what she did, and she goes, "You're going to be fine. Don't worry about anything." What are you talking about? No one's fine. No one. Unless like God himself showed up to you and said, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." No one's fine. All of us are repenting of sins. It is the death of repentance. It is the attitude of presumption. And even worse, it gives into a angsty despair, a lethargicness over the souls. When there's no urgency, there's no zeal. I'm sorry here. I thought I deleted all this section. Taking it back, one of the points he raises in the book is the importance of authenticness versus the real piety. And one of the things that always comes up with knights is the reality that we have this name, and the reality that we have this rule, but also the reality that we do not have a war. We do not train with arms. We're not marching on the Holy Land. It's
yourself.
And it can be embarrassing when there are so many people out there today who, with pictures of Templars and their avatars, I remember once talking to a Knight of the Holy Sepulchre who was very convinced that they would, go to the Holy Land if they were ever asked to. And it was so delusional about the nature of his commitment and the nature of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. It led me to pity the poor guy because he had obviously had misdirected his zeal. So what do people need to see within us? Well, one, no one cares about your particulars. That is an important thing to lie down. And if you share it, you'll be hateful. All right? One of the reasons why spiritual direction has to be a frequent point in a knight's life is that every day we should be testing the limits of our strength. Every day we should be trying to find out if we've grown in some strength of God. This is what everybody does, by the way. Athletes have to train to what, right? If they do strength training, they have to lift at their maximum strength and try to go beyond it every time they train. All right. Scholars have to build upon the knowledge they obtained yesterday to push to grow in knowledge. So what can a poor knight do? Well, because we don't have a war, he has to wage a war both within himself and against demons. If he is not continually at that warfare, then he will not manifest an authentic character to those around him. No one cares about your particulars. I mean, I do, and you can talk to me about it and I'll understand. Your director does, and you can talk to him about it and he'll understand. But no one cares about your particulars, and you should not ever share them. When we say we need to manifest within ourselves that there should be within us a certain characteristic of tenacity that indicates a man in a struggle, not a certain blasé lethargy characterized by good times and putting their feet up. St. Peter Julian Maillard, the Apostle of the Eucharist, he actually wrote in his book, he says, do you want to know about holy people? Well, I'll tell you about holy people. He said, they're not what you think. They are not pleasant people to always deal with. Oftentimes, they're cantankerous. Oftentimes, they're stretched thin. Now, I'm mentioning this because in the book, he talks about...
Are you blocking the live stream?
Yes, because I don't see a point in watching myself. Did Dom Jason just message you?
He said, I think the live stream camera's not focused on what it should be focused on. I don't know what that means.
Is that better, Dom Jason?
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. All right. Well, here I am. Yes, laugh out loud. Okay. I don't like looking at myself. The book makes a big emphasis upon how, and it uses St. Bernard as an example many times about how he was a gentle, caring person of souls, and yet he was firm. And it talks about manifest within you kind of the perfection of spiritual gifts. And I want to tell you that if you're not there, do not be discouraged by that. It is okay to be ferocious and to be young and to learn discernment the way it was almost always learned, which is through struggle, which is through overextending yourself and learning your limit. which is through humble direction. Which, going back to that, I want everybody to make sure they meet with their directors during Lent. And that to remember that the freedom you enjoy in direction is that by embracing a director, you don't have to worry about, am I doing too little or too much? You go to your director with what you want to do and you ask for his blessing. He either gives it or he doesn't. He either thinks it's enough for you or he doesn't. And any apprehension that you don't think you're doing enough, that needs to be brought up. If you think you're doing too much, that needs to be brought up. It needs to be brought up whether you feel zeal for souls. It needs to be brought up what fear you have of obtaining eternal life. If you have any fear, do you worry about lapses? Do you have lapses? It helps if you go to confession to the same person, but if you don't, then certain things with lapses need to be brought up in direction. But back to Peter or Julie Amard. And then also look at our saints. King David. In the latter divine sense, St. John Climacus, when speaking in his chapter on lust, he said, "No one dareth say they have a heart equal with David." This was a monk speaking to monks who had reached transforming union. He's attributed with that. Who lived amongst angels, clairvoyants, and miracle workers. At a time in church history where monasticism was ferocious. And what did he say of King David? He said, "Let no one dare say they have his heart." Why? Because it was the heart after God's heart. He said, this man lapsed. This man fell through lust. And yet, right? And yet, he came back better. And so the interior story, and we also see within David, even after he had the heart of God, even after he was king, even after all these other things, we see him continually making these mistakes. And in his mistakes he made, people suffered for it. His kingdom suffered when he chose to survey the people against the Lord's wishes. And at first he let the people suffer a pestilence until he repented, and then his family had to suffer. We see David, even after his sons openly betray him, even after they seek his life, still being reluctant to treat them according to the law. It was something that's always bothered me about David, and I know not a commentary on it, was he never put his son to death who raped his daughter, or his, you know what I mean. Like, that was against the law. That was against the Mosaic law. You had to put those people to death. But he showed mercy. I mean, I guess that's a type of the heart of God too, because it was his son. But I've always wondered about that in my heart, about why he didn't obey the law there. I guess it was an important type foreshadowing maybe of the future mercy. I don't know. Of course, that son went on to nearly murder him and supplant him too. So when we're going through the chapter, do not be discouraged by the fact that he's talking about these interior gifts that manifests itself once you reach a certain degree of perfection. But I'm also adding to that, do not forget that Peter lived 3 years with Christ and he denied him. The apostles still fought amongst each other bitterly sometimes. The early church fathers, Jerome, even after he was a great mind, a great saint, he was still a cantankerous and difficult person. St. Pius V persecuted St. Philip Neri. That St. Philip Neri used to say of Ignatius of Loyola that he had a principle in his life, do the opposite of whatever Ignatius did. That St. Celestine abused a group of Benedictine monks and forced them to adopt his
form of Benedictinism on a whim. And when he retired, they viewed it as a vindication of them being afflicted. That the saints are oftentimes very difficult people. So I'm mentioning that because I'm not asking you to become a difficult person if you're not. But it's something to keep in mind as you're going through the book. He also talks about how a lot of language about fire and light within us and how other people catch it. And we see this within our liturgical prayer. The hymns, especially thinking of that, the hymns said regularly at terce, hymns at lauds, hymns at prime. We see this constant theme of fire, right? And it says at one point, right, and let others catch that living flame, right, in the terce hymn, right? And one of the things that the Knights do live by is we try to keep the liturgical hours according to the day, the moment within the day that they're supposed to be said. If we have fire within us, and we know how fires burn only if they're given great fuel. And so a man should, at the very beginning of his day, build a strong fire. And then as the day goes on, he needs to keep throwing logs into the fire. Now here's the amazing thing about fires. If there is a tumult, if there is a ferocious fire, even throwing water on it makes the fire burn brighter and faster. Even throwing water on a fire makes the fire grow faster, which means that when the saints have their enthusiasm, when the world attempts to dampen them with either worldly cares, persecution, or anything else, it doesn't cause a saint's fire to diminish. He rejoices that he has something to suffer for Christ, and as a result, his fire goes up. Oh, I'm suffering temptation, affliction. How wonderful. His fire burns brighter. Now, of course, the fire is not us. The fire is the life of God within the soul. Well, what does the fire do? What happens in a great tumult? The size and volume of the fire begins to exceed the objects that it burns. The size of the fire begins to exceed the objects it burns. What else? It has byproducts. Sparks, smoke. Now, when this fire exceeds the size of the object it burns, this is when our personalities begin to become hidden. The old man dies and the new man emerges, and we have been put on a new Christ within us. The sparks are the emulations of grace. Now, with sparks, enough of them, what happens? Ground that is dead, that has no fire, becomes enkindled. Grounds that are dead, that have no fire, become enkindled. This is why we know that a saint who is a contemplative, as we see in the lives of, for example, certain virgin saints, who were not preachers, who had no contact with the outside world, and yet around them, holiness exploded. Sinners were converted. Priests preaching got better. Sacraments were more readily observed. Because their life of grace was sending off sparks. And smoke. What is smoke? Smoke is the enemy of the eyes of the world. Smoke protects the church. Smoke fills wicked men's eyes with water, and it drives them away. It gives room to the church. Why? because of fear. Right? Because of fear. Because when you see, when people experience any type of even mortification today, it fills them with this kind of terror, right? Because as soon as somebody starts believing in God, people start examining themselves, going, well, what am I? What if they're right? I mean, that's one of the awful questions. What if they're right? Or when people observe terrible things happening, when certain men are afflicted, right? I mean, look at the pagan Romans. They knew this about it. Remember the stories from the early martyrs? How sometimes they would put a person under tribulation, they'd attempt to kill them, and then after failing numerous times, they decide to spare them and let them live alone in their father's house because they were too afraid of the God that was on their side. That's smoke. And so, as that fire grows, not only does it give off sparks, not only does the personality become consumed, the church is protected. The church is protected because the enemies of the church cannot see through the smoke easily. Okay. So I made mention earlier that the great work of a priest is spiritual direction. And so with the knights, it then goes to what is the great work of the knights? Is it, and it's in our constitutions, that the principal aim of this order is Christian perfection, which leads to a consequence. If the principal aim of this order is Christian perfection, then the principal aim of this order is, first, that its members should know, love, and serve God. Know through formation, love through prayer, serve through the apostolate. Know through formation, love through prayer, serve through the apostolate. And as such, if there's ever a decision that needs to be made between active works for the church or formation of members or prayer, right? Obviously, there has to be a certain degree of formation first, even with prayer, because people need to know how to say Vespers in order to say Vespers, right? But if there's ever a choice, the right answer is choose perfection and prayer first. Mindful that we are not contemplatives. But if there's a choice between the two of them, and it's not an emergency, it's not a one-off. I'm talking about the day-to-day grind. We must listen to what St. Bernard teaches in regards to this, what St. John of the Cross teaches, what St. Teresa of Avila teaches, what every saint has taught, which is prayer first, then work. And God forbid that we mention any type of levity. Like levity is at the end of those other things. Levity is earned after one is fatigued from doing the other matters first. Then there's some rest because it's necessary. But the bow must be brought back first before you worry, and shot. The arrow must be shot before you worry about letting the bow rest. So the leaders of the order, if you ever find yourself in that position of novice master, you ever find yourself as preceptor, it should be geared force towards worrying about the brotherhood and the individual state of the members of the brotherhood first, and that they are being faithful first and foremost to their prayer and sacramental life, followed by those guiding factors of their prayer and sacramental life, which is spiritual direction and spiritual reading. Now, once those things are worked out, if they want to start doing long hours of Eucharistic adoration or long hours of other things that are not strictly called for by the rule and they lacked an apostolate, They must do some type of consistent apostolate first. But this creates a series of priorities within us. Not only that, but because we are not interested in the flim-flams of the modern religious scenes, our constitutions demand that we always consider the classics of spirituality first, over and beyond any type of modern writings. The classics of spirituality first, and of course our own Principal Father, St. Bernard, but all the classics which have a great harmony within one another. So once again, all right, when one is selecting spiritual reading material, once you're out of being a novice and you're independent again, you should pick those works that are in conformity with this end, which is to form you to the mind of the church is developed by the masters that have been presented through the people of Christ throughout the centuries, through a manifest, through the fruition of the saints produced by them. We don't have to dispute, for example, the imitation of Christ. You have to worry about the teachings of the spiritual combat or the introduction of the devout life. I don't have to scrutinize St. Augustine's confessions. I do have to on modern works or unknown authors. It is very important as well that in your relationship with me as your novice master or with your superior, that while, of course, we try to be sensitive to your feelings, that you can't fall into a habit of minimizing your responsibilities to this brotherhood. I know how hard it is, especially we've just lost a member recently. I understand how hard it is to be have the obligations and married life, or lay life and work life, and to do this. And so I can be a fellow struggler with you, which is what I want to be. But I cannot ever minimize the responsibilities, the free choice that you've made for yourself. I then become a kind, as St. Bernard calls it, a kind tyrant. That conscience plaguing at you when you do not do your job, do not do your duty, that's the hound of heaven. Would you have me shoo it away? It's a sign of God's affection that his dog is coming up to you to admonish you gently, just with a small rebuke of your heart. I mean, St. Therese even experienced these rebukes after she was a novice master, and she was far into her spiritual development at that point. The saints even experience these rebukes. They write about them in their letters and so forth with their directors. Because they sinned, they continued to sin. So I can never minimize it, and I also can't. We don't want our religion to become a sham. We don't want this brotherhood to be a sham, in the sense that it becomes enough for a person to not be growing in their ardor for Christ and our religion. There has to be some type of a manifestation of an increase of either humility, repentance, or ardor. I mention humility and repentance because once you've been doing this long enough, it seems to me, there's always some period of fatigue that sets in. And that's where you get schooled in humility pretty hard as you continue to fail at things you used to find easy to do. But then that brings forth other good fruits. It's a period where you rebuild yourself upon humility and your weakness. And then finally, and this is, none of you are married, so this is being directed at the novices who are not here, who are. Married men never, ever give in to this attitude that somehow, because we're married, that God doesn't have high expectations of you. The world, and even unfortunately priests, will cut you some slack. And I'm thinking especially of the unmarried. They don't know because they're not there. And so they cut you some slack because they're married, and they assume a certain weakness comes from it. And they're right. There is a certain weakness that comes from it, but there's also a certain strength that comes from it as well. We're just a little bit more out of whack in the sense that you have a predominant arm, right? And one arm tends to be stronger than the other. Well, that kind of happens in married men. Is that due to the nature of our domestic life, if it's lived well, we begin to have a certain lopsidedness within us. A certain strengths are manifest more easily in us, I think. Because if you don't develop those strengths, your whole family sinks very quickly. And so we have to focus on those strengths just to stay afloat sometimes. But that should never be an excuse for letting the other arm become weak. Just because we have a predominant strength doesn't mean that this other arm shouldn't be as strong as everybody else's arm as well. That up to the expectation of strength. And say if our order says, if this was a strength test and you had to curl 50 pounds in each arm, all a married man should be able to do is he should be able to do 50 in each arm, but one of his arms might have to do 80, and that's okay. When we talk about family being the exception, what we mean is that there's some times where raw necessity is going to force you away that unmarried men just won't happen. You're not going to miss Vespers because your wife's in labor, right? You're not going to have to cancel direction because everybody's sick at the household or something like that, right? You're not going to delay at writing back to somebody because, it was you had to deal with some type of school problem, or you had to pull extra hours to pay a bill that was unexpected, all right? Because you have more responsibilities. But that doesn't mean that the other arm you can't get that strength up. And once again, the solution to that is always found in the interior life. So we don't if the world is presenting you in a circumstance where people are going easy on you, don't go easy on yourself, ever. Don't listen to the lies. There isn't two flavors of holiness, as St. John Chrysostom taught. There isn't one for monks, one for lay people. There's different rules and responsibilities, and that's it. But there's one perfection, one charity, one Christ. And as a result of that, right, you might have a harder grind, and that's okay. You didn't want to live a long time anyway, did you? So embrace it. Okay. On that last thought, so the building, with that being central to it, because we see that in the life of the church, the most important thing is the development of intimacy within people. And we also, and I completely skipped over this section, we look at Christ and we look at the Acts of the Apostles. What were they the most solicitous for? Instructing the apostles, right? Christ would speak in parables to the multitude, but it was only given to the apostles to know the secrets. When the apostles had the ministry, what do we see? Then spending tons of time with some individuals, staying with them for months at a time. Paul has taught over months the religion, intimately. The eunuch was chased after by Philip. I'll explain the scriptures to you. So never fall into this modern attitude that it's somehow better. I mean, social media, I think, has really proved this. I mean, you can share all the Catholic memes on Facebook you want. I mean, I'm sure it makes a difference somewhere, but take that versus a close Catholic friend who builds you up, who admonishes you, who corrects you, who encourages you. No comparison. No comparison in the difference it makes. And that's what the church needs more of. That's how the church will survive persecution. That's how the church has grown up. It is through that mutual fire burning. And so that is the principle, the canons say, what's our principal thing? Is forming priests. What's the principal thing of the knights? Perfecting ourselves first, forming other knights. What are you about when people ask you? Christian perfection, living the rule. That's our way of saying making real knights. That's what we're about. Real ones, not posers, not facade, not having silly little, finding every event we can go to where we can process up in our gowns and have everybody say, ooh, and then, what do you guys do? Do you do anything? No, we really actually don't. We dress up, we go to some nice things, we eat some food with some people. It's all very nice. I couldn't believe it when I saw one of these groups advertising their annual cocktail ball, their annual ball. Made me want to roll over and die. That's what we're about. First and foremost is forming other men to embrace this way of life. Anyway, so I will take questions now. The next section of the book, I'm sorry if I read ahead, but at least it prepares you for it, is he has sections on how to prepare for a lot of liturgical actions. And then also he talks extensively about self-custody. And so we'll be talking about how, and as you already know from the rule, that when the rule says things like deny yourself completely, prefer nothing to the love of Christ, it's talking about self-custody and a lot of it. And then I'll speak from experience too about how people are obviously at different places. And so there's obviously a rule that we have in common, but then there's that rule which you develop at the individual level with your novice master and with your spiritual director, because there is no you're done. I mean, until literally abstain from all worldly things, and until your speech is perfect, and until you foresee future events and you work miracles, and then it's not enough. Then you have to do more at that point too. And at some point, and I'll let you know if I ever I've actually never read of a saint yet who went, I'm there. If I ever do read one, I'll let you know. I've read some people, and I think this sums it up quite perfectly. There was a desert father who was dying, who was super advanced, and his children were there, and he was weeping. And they said, why do you weep, Father? He goes, I don't wish to die yet. Why? He goes, because I've just now become a beginner. And then they said, upon hearing this, they then knew he was perfect. And of course, there's that great St. John Climaticus talks about in the Latter Divine Ascent, about a monk who had demons come to him and tempt him to vanity. And so he wrote up on the wall, perfect chastity, absolute silence, uninterrupted prayer. And then he would say to himself, and this confused the demons. He said he drove the demons away through the confusion, because demons can read your actions, but they can't actually read your soul. Well, that's disputed, by the way, I think among some. I don't know if the church has decided on that question, but I've read different points of view on that in different authors. But I agree with the whole demons are incapable of reading a soul. The reason why I believe that is because of certain aspects about Mary and Christ that I don't think they were able to see. They knew they were highly favored. I don't think they understood the extent until after. the resurrection, that I think they were blinded. But I don't know that. I've read that from the fathers, though, so one of them at least. And he wrote these things up on the wall, but he'd tell himself interiorly, he goes, if you had all these things, you still would be very far from God. And by this way, he tricked the demons. Anyway, I thought that was very clever. Okay, I'll take questions. Any questions, of course, from our live stream audience? Oh, here we go. Are authors like Frank Sheen, Fulton Sheen considered classics at this point? I think so. I think Fulton Sheen is amongst English-speaking Catholics. I think he's proven also by the numerous converts. I would include G.K. Chesterton and certain other. Who else would I include in that? Cardinal Wiseman, Father Faber. Of course, John Henry Newman is now a saint, so that makes it a little easier to say that. And of course, Frank Sheed, for English-speaking Catholics, he was so instrumental in the theology of the mind of the church before the church went crazy. And he continued to be a source of sanity even afterwards. I believe on our first reading list, by the way, for the night's Introduction to Theology, is that what it's called? Anyway, it's one of Frank Sheed's introductory book was required reading, or it was either required or highly suggested. I don't remember. Theology for Beginners. Yeah, that's a good book. So, your reading should, of course, be geared. You should always give primacy to required reading for the nights, and then right, and then after this year, the tithe is coming up in August. Everybody who pays the tithe will receive a copy of our reading books throughout the year. So this year we had steak knives. This year for nights we had The Public Life of Jesus Christ, which was a 2-volume set by not a well-known author, but Father Alban Goodyear. We had a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict for Benedictine Oblates, because our rule is so close to the Rule of St. Benedict. We had a book by Edmund Duffy, a well-known historian. We're supposed to read history as well on medieval Christianity. And then we had a book on the Templars, a new history on the Templars. I forgot by which author, but it rounded out a lot of areas that are kind of neglected in that. This upcoming year, I haven't gone over the reading list yet with Jason, and I'll have a chaplain look at it too. So, but yeah. Anything else? You, Mark?
Yeah,
sure.
Thanks for having me, Don Noah. You spoke earlier about the particulars, and so no one cares about particulars. Your particulars,
right?
And then not to go sharing that, like share the particulars with your director, with the novice master.
Yeah.
Could you expound on that?
Yes. In Abandonment to Divine Providence, years ago, I didn't like it, and now I like it very much. But he talked about how obnoxious certain people can be when they try to force their spirituality on other people, not force their devotions or other things. I'm not saying you shouldn't share your devotions. I think in friendships, real Catholic friendships, that's the right place for it, is to share things that you find helpful, or books or other things that you do that for certain remedies. What I mean by no one cares about your particulars is it is so easy to take out your treasure that has been stored up in the kingdom and to start recklessly throwing it around like you're a rich man, when in reality, we are all quite poor in the spiritual life. To the extent that is possible, our spiritual life should be kept exceedingly private. even with the 15 close people. Real religion happens in cars when no one else is there. It's in churches when no one comes. It's at night when no one's watching. It's in the secret inner prayer during boring being stuck in traffic or what have you. It's eating foods that other people like that you despise so that you can mortify yourself. That's where real religion happens. That's where the real gains happen. And when I say no one cares, when people bring out these hidden aspects of themselves, you'll find that either it rightfully disgusts people, or even if you get praise for it, then you're disgusted with yourself because you realize that what you've really done is decided to basically prance nude in front of somebody. The intimacy between the soul and God is most akin to the intimacy between a man and his wife. It is something that that people should be able to see in you and your wife a certain affection and tenderness that comes out from the love within the relationship. And the same thing between you and God. We want our light to shine before men, but we don't want to talk about the acts that cause our light to shine within us. And I once had somebody look at me and they said, well, and then I decided to take out my rosary because I have a special relation with the Blessed Mother. And I just looked at them and I just thought to myself, what's wrong with you? Don't say things like that. I mean, that should be kept hidden. This isn't, all right, guys, let's take out our rosary and let's pray it. That's an admonition to pray. Not, all right, well, let me tell you about this secret moment that should have been between me and the Blessed Mother. When I say no one cares, we may be very impressed with one of our efforts, but to another person, it may be nothing. Like it may be a huge triumph of the will for you to give up music during Lent or something. To another person who doesn't listen to music, they go, well, what's so great about that? Who cares? Right? Or it might be a big deal to go to daily mass. Maybe that's like something you don't like, but to a person who likes going to mass, it's like, we should have been doing that all along, you slugger. And I think that's where when I'm saying that no one cares, before swine, worldlings, they'll look at you like you're a madman. Before pious people, they either think you're a fool, or they'll look at you and say, why are you saying this? You're not my director. Stop, bothering me with your ideas. Or maybe they're very pious or they're good people and they want to encourage everybody. And then all of a sudden they start flattering you so much that you feel like ashamed and unclean because you're getting all this praise. And then you realize you're a sinner and you didn't deserve any of it. And that's what I was trying to communicate. So we really want to the best of our ability to let the inner light, if we have any light, come out in us in that way that it comes out between spouses, between friends, between other people. It's not, and please don't mistake it for that other thing, which is over-familiarity with God. Please don't that is not, people sometimes, you want to talk about facades. All right, one of the facades in a friendship or a facade in a relationship is when people are overly familiar with one another in front of others as a means to attempt to fake intimacy. All right, well, people do that with God as well, or with the saints, or with the sacraments, or with being in church. And I'm not saying judge your neighbor. I'm saying look at yourself in the mirror in this instance and make sure you're not doing it. I speak of these things because I'm a sinner and I, go to confession and struggle with things myself. But like a manifest over familiarity with divine things is faking that inner light that has to come without us knowing that it's coming. That's why the saints could simultaneously literally have uncreated light coming from their bodies and yet view themselves as the worst of sinners. That seems like it wouldn't be possible that they would be aware of it, but they genuinely were not. That's how St. Philip Neri could weep over his sins, and yet he had a large heart that literally like was protruding from its chest, and he burned with divine fire so much that steam used to come off of his body in the rain. He had physical manifestations of divine favor, and yet he was afflicted. He was an afflicted man. I love it. It's so real. That's what you're aiming for. Yeah.
It seems to bode well with the principle of humility, of not just never speaking of yourself in all things, either in the negative or the positive, because in some way self-love will creep in. Back
to the spiritual masters. That's truly what was said by Kempis, by Faber, by the Introduction to Devout Life. The Introduction to Devout Life even warns, he says, never say even that you're a terrible sinner unless you really, really believe it. That's that facade I'm talking about. Well, we can say, I know I should feel myself as the worst of men, unless you genuinely feel that. And by the way, like in these later chapters, he'll say, worldlings will pick up on this and they'll beat the crap out of you. You know, if they detect that this is phony. By the way, that's one of the reasons why bad Christians are such a terrible plight in the world, because you see these people get up there, they put on these facade. Everybody could see through it, including non-believers, and they rip these people to shreds. By the way, that's a little favor that they're getting, because we need to be ripped to shreds occasionally, because we're all sinners, and our friends do that for us. My Jason here, he's known me since childhood. He's lived with me, for months. At a time, I mean, he knows me well. There's not much of putting on an act with him. I mean, it's like your confessor. There's no putting on it. If you make good confessions, there's no putting on an act. He knows that you suck, right? You don't have to act like something. I mean, he knows. He knows you suck. We need that. We need to be that fire. Don't view that as a bad thing. View that as the fuel is being burned up and the fire is, getting bigger in proportion to the fuel.
So the particulars are not the sparks.
No,
How do you distinguish?
Well, sparks are a divine manifestation. They're something that happens without our effort. We don't direct our sparks. Sparks are directed by the wind, and the wind is the Spirit of God.
Okay.
Right? So remember, our goal should be the building up our interior life. And that manifests itself in other people. But we can't force that. Now, I think I can anticipate a question. He goes, well, then do we stop engaging with people? No, I'm not saying to stop engaging with people. We engage with people in relation to our duties and our relationships with them. And as Paul says, right, I was sorrowful with the sorrowful, I was joyous with the joyous, right? We admonish, we encourage, we correct, we cry, we assist, we give alms, we build up, we answer questions, but we know our place. Knights have a place in the church. We are brothers. We are brothers. We are brothers to the faithful. We may wear habits, but we're one of the faithful. We're just a lay person. We're not super lay people. We're literally one of the bros. We are with them, though that doesn't mean that we try hard to stay to our way of life, which by necessity cuts out a lot of freedom that other laymen still have. The difference is that freedom is meant to choose what works for them not worldly things. And many people choose worldly things and not things that work. That's the tragedy. But we're one of the co-strugglers, and we should impress that on people. We should impress upon people, as I say all the time, what we do with the office is not exceptional. It's not admirable. It's not elite. It's common. It was normal. An hour per is nothing. Nothing. Right? Daily Mass, for if you can go, not a huge sacrifice. Daily Mass is over in like what, 35, 45 minutes? Even if you're one of those people who needs to make the 15-minute after Thanksgiving, hour, right? A little bit of spiritual reading, should have been doing that anyway. People watch TV shows every night. Tons of spiritual books are totally fun to read. You just have to develop a taste for it. Tastes are developed by doing it. There are people who read spiritual books who totally suck, right? Everything else, and they have a taste for reading, and they manage to pull it off. What we do is not exceptional or elite or anything else. We have a place in the church, and that place is one of primarily, right, of being the people, the duty to, as the world screams something, that we scream back at them, right? We defend the church. We don't back down from the confession of our faith, even if that means something at a personal cost to us. Secondarily, though, our goal is to build up our neighbor by being with him. And we do that partially through what our apostolate is as well, whatever that is. So that's how we engage our neighbor. And those are, so when we're doing sparks, right? I mean, my audiobooks are not sparks. That's something that I hope comes from people listening to the audiobooks, but I have to leave that to the Spirit. Right?
So you're saying that particulars are more or less what we will in order to conform ourselves, like to actively dispose ourselves to receive the grace. So that
right. It's your prayer rule. The particulars are your prayer rule and your discipline. Those are
the interior life.
The interior, yeah, basically.
Okay,
How you lead
the
technical aspects of leading your interior life.
So then if you take a particular and try to foist it upon someone, it's almost like you trying to fabricate a spark.
No, I don't think so. I think it shows an ignorance of how the interior life works.
Okay.
Remember that when Christ taught his apostles to pray, he taught them the Our Father. Don't try to out Christ. I mean, you can encourage somebody to read a book as we do. If people ask you specific questions, you should answer them, right? Have an answer to every man. But the mistake, but I've run into this in my own life. It's like the rosary. There's an attitude in the church. It's a bad attitude. Everybody has to say the rosary no matter what. No, that's not true. I think that's wrong. Don't throw 5,000 books at saints or quotes that somebody quote mined into a little 15-page pamphlet for me. I've read those same books. There were tons of saints who didn't say the rosary. There are people who can't say the rosary well. Maybe they should say other prayers. Or maybe if they really do have a limited time and there's something else that helps them foster that love better, those are things for spiritual directors. Those are things for other people. I think that's where the mistake, that's that franchise spirituality I'm talking about. That forcing things on people, right?
Could you call it like cookie cutter? Or?
I call it franchise spirituality because franchises have to be run according to certain rules. Yeah, cookie cutter, but cookie cutters, franchises, it's a much more broad thing. Like there isn't some designer Catholic life. It's not like, we'll just have this set of this and this set of that, and you'll have a balanced diet. People need different things, and they need different things at different times too.
In the particulars, I mean, the source is all the same,
right? Which is Christ.
Christ.
It's life. It's growing,
and the grace is from the sacraments,
right? But we
you're
can't,
talking in the particulars,
right? And we should run from anybody who's basically somebody's wrong if they adopt a cookie cutter. There is a recipe for all of us. All of us need to pursue the sacraments.
Yeah.
But even the frequency of the sacraments can vary from person to person. It's better for a person to make one good confession a month than 4 bad ones. Right? If daily confession was a thing, and I wish it was, but if it was a thing, right? There's a way to do daily confession right. Like the early fathers did it, the early desert fathers. That's the way to do confession right. Daily confession right. Where one is literally revealing not just their sins, but their very thoughts that happen throughout the day. Thoughts, not just sinful ones, like all of them. That's how daily confession was done. There's like I said, so the sacraments are there, but everything else, like, barring, if you want to join our brotherhood, you follow our rule. And like our rule, the office is above the daily rosary. The rosary is encouraged, but the office comes first, right? Just like if you only had the time to do your office, the mass, and pick two, office, mass, rosary, you pick office and mass. Because
Well, if you don't do the rosary, you're not on the team.
yeah, right. Because mass is explicitly mentioned in the rule. It says you must go to communion as frequently as possible. Now you can say your rosary at mass. I mean, but that's what I mean about those are our particulars, and we have to be steadfast to them because we've made a vow to God. Now we need to keep it, right? But we don't want, like I said, people shouldn't be in the business of being spiritual directors. Like I said, my main goal with saying the particulars, though, is trying to keep your treasure secret in the kingdom as much as possible, and that to realize that the interior life the correct manifestation is not sharing what works for you, which is this modern, awful, tacky thing that came about through self-help groups. Like, John, can you please, Shantam, just tell us what helps you? I mean, what helps you? No, because what helps me may not help you. Did you know? Think about it this way. St. Philip Neri, when people asked him his story, you know what he told them? He said, my secret is my own. He wouldn't tell them anything. In today's world, sometimes people feel the need to tell every aspect of their religion to people, and we should get away from that. We want to, especially in our interior practices now. It won't help us do them. It won't necessarily help them. You'll know when it's the right time to share particulars. And it does happen. I'll give you a concrete example. Venerable Matt Talbot, in his life, once a friend, I don't know if he embraced him or whatever, but he saw that he was wearing a chain around his body. You never share those types of things with people. But his friend asked him why, and he explained that it was for his total consecration to the Virgin Mary. And his friend indicated that he liked that very much, so he went out and bought him a chain and gave it to him as a gift. Okay, that's an example of a man sharing something that's deeply and should be kept very private, especially those types of, especially in today's world, people don't understand them. Those things have to be kept very private. In the other end of the spectrum, if you have charge of souls, like if you ever become a novice master will, or somebody is a preceptor here, and people need to share certain things with you, you can encourage certain things as certain remedies, but you have authority over or an influence over that person. And then but you're directing the particular to their needs, right? Now, St. Louis de Montfort, he actually wrote a hymn to the discipline. And he believed in it so much, he used to go to soldiers. He thought soldiers needed it particularly. Of course, remember at that time in the army, that was a common way they dealt out discipline, was to whip you. He used to bring just armfuls of disciplines for the soldiers when he would preach missions, and he'd hand them out like rosaries. Because of sins of the flesh. It was a remedy. It was a way to help them stay faithful to their lives and other things. So, but he's like, and I'm not telling people don't have your rosary making apostolate. Like, don't hand out sacramentals. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying hand out miraculous medals. Don't tell people how much you kiss them all day. Hand out rosaries. Don't tell people how many times you said the rosary. Give out books. Don't tell people how much spiritual reading you do. by all means, talk about things you like in your spiritual reading. Don't talk about how it drove you to tears and you had a vision of the Virgin Mary while reading it. Keep that to yourself. Anyway, any other questions? This is getting a little late. I could keep talking for hours, as you know. You're good?
Well, thank you. It just reminds me of the idea of also I've heard it said, don't share the particular direction you're giving, say, in the confessional, because what may apply in that case,
Yeah, and he can't defend himself either. So if you mess up, like, the priest can't go and say, I didn't say that, you liar.
Right.
Why didn't you tell Noah to do X, Y, and Z? Well, he can't even acknowledge such a statement.
Right.
Yeah, it's best to keep your confessions private as much as possible.
Right.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll end this. And so formation will be, we have our retreat next weekend, God willing, although things are a little up in the air about that because of this diocesan thing. The canons are going to get back to me about a private retreat versus a public one. So our next meeting will not be the 28th. It'll most likely be the Easter is the 10th. I mean the 11th, right?
13th. Is that right?
No, it's the 11th, right? I think so. Or maybe it's the 12th. It's the 12th. So our next meeting will be April 4th. We'll finish up the work, and then we won't have another meeting again until after the octave of Easter. So like I said, please make sure that all of you go to spiritual direction if possible. And remember, if you make changes to your prayer rule, make sure I get a copy of it updated. And on that note, thank you very much. God bless, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.